Hello and welcome to our webinar on the basics of private lending. My name is Larissa Greene and I'm going to walk you through what this process looks like in a retirement account. So many of you joining the call today may be familiar with private lending. You maybe borrow private funds in order to make real estate investments, or you might lend money personally or maybe from your business to others making investments. But today we're going to talk specifically about private lending through a retirement account. I do want to let you know that I will take questions throughout the webinar, so please feel free to type any questions into the question box. I do keep it muted just to have a clean recording and to keep it nice and clean for everybody on so that everybody can hear the audio really well. But if you have questions, look to the tool or taskbar on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can click on the question box and type your questions in there, and I'll be taking questions throughout. Again, my name is Larissa. I'm with Advanta IRA. I've been with Advanta since 2011, so actually just beyond my 11 years, so that was in August. And so in my 11 years with Advanta IRA, I have done a lot of the back office work to start. So I did new accounts, transfers, transactions for clients, check coding, paid bills on behalf of IRAs and received income, and all of the things that sort of go into self-directed retirement accounts. And then probably around 2013, I would say, I started doing education and business development, some marketing as well. And so many of you know me as I'm out and about in the community, attending real estate investment club meetings, teaching classes, talking to real estate agents, and joining different lunch and learns. And so that is what I do for the company. And I also teach webinars and seminars for Advanta IRA. We have webinars every week. They're always no cost, no obligation. So I hope that aside from this one, you guys will join us and check out many of our other educational events as well. Although today we're going to talk a little bit about the rules for self-directing retirement accounts and how they work and what the IRS deems a prohibited transaction or disqualified person, something that we don't do is give investment, legal, or tax advice. And so if you say to us, hey, can this investment be done in an IRA, we'll talk maybe about the different rules involved and give you some guidance. But if you're looking for specific advice, we might be able to refer you to an attorney or a CPA, someone that has worked with our clients in the past that could give you further advice and maybe their opinion. We can also refer you possibly for people that can look at investments for you and questions like, is this a good rate of return for me? Is this a good investment? Those are questions we definitely cannot answer. So just keep that in mind, that this webinar is for educational purposes only, and we'll talk and give you some information on IRS rules, but ultimately your investment is your own. Sometimes when we get to talk about the rules and different investment strategies that we see in a self-directed account, it seems like a lot of information. So I always like to sort of reiterate the key points for a self-directed IRA. And so those are posted here on your screen. Any IRA or former employer plan qualifies to be self-directed. And I think people find that surprising a lot of times. I've been asked before, doesn't have to be a Roth IRA if I want a self-directed? And the truth is, if it ends in IRA, it can be self-directed, and any former employer plan. And so we sort of put emphasis on former employer plan because if you're currently working for the employer, if you're currently participating in a plan, it's less likely that they will allow you to move those monies into a self-directed IRA with Advanta, although I always do tell people you can check with them. I'm seeing more and more that what they call an in-service rollover is more likely than it ever was before. So you can always check, find out if there's something, some amount of money that you would be able to roll over into an IRA. And again, that's going to be based on the plan administrator and the plan rules for that employer. You choose the investment, so we don't sell anything at all. You find the investment, you make that investment within your IRA account. We just simply help you do that through your retirement account. So we basically make sure that the IRA is properly titled for that investment, and then we handle the record keeping for you going forward. And then all expenses are paid by the IRA and any income is received by the IRA. And that's very important because that's going to be based on IRS rules. And there's really no exception to that unless you're partnering personal funds or another participant is partnering into that investment, and then the expenses and income would be divided along the lines of the ownership. So if you own it 50% in your IRA, then the IRA is always going to be responsible for 50% of the expenses, and it will always receive 50% of the income. And so those are really going to be the biggest takeaway points for you. I also want to mention before I forget that I did post the slides as a handout, again, so that you guys can download them. If you look at the taskbar or control panel on the right-hand side for GoToWebinar, you're going to see handouts there. If you open that box, the slides are posted there as a PDF for you. A little bit about Advanta. We've been in business for almost 20 years. Actually, 2023 will be 20 years of service for self-directed retirement accounts. We have our main office in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. We also have a marketing office in Atlanta, Georgia, but we can help anybody anywhere. And I often get asked, well, I mean, you guys are in Florida, so I guess that means that you're only sort of working on that coast or that area. And the truth is that we have clients even worldwide. So if you have a US-based retirement account, you can self-direct it. And so our clients are really all over the map, and that includes outside of the US. We've sort of always been the same people doing the same thing, meaning that, you know, many of you have been with us for many years, and so you have a more personal knowledge of the staff here at Advanta. And so if you do have an account with us, you know that you get an account manager, a dedicated account manager assigned to your account, and that person is with you for the life of the account, and they can help you with anything from making a contribution to your IRA all the way through to making an investment. And you know, we really put a lot of pride in that structure because we feel that our clients know their account managers really well and they have a relationship with them. So when they're ready to make an investment, they know exactly who they're going to be reaching out to in order to help them along that process. Just here's a little bit about our Learning Center, and I already mentioned that we always have events going on and they're always no cost, no obligation. So you can check out our events calendar, advantaira.com/events. You can check out our video library and find us on YouTube, and also follow along on our blog. And we try to keep everything current and relevant to what's going on. And so I think it would be a great benefit to you if you're still just starting to learn about self-directed IRAs, or even if you're a seasoned investor, to keep up with our events, because there's always good information going out through those. And one of the webinars that I can think of off the top of my head that I think a lot of people would find really beneficial, we just did a webinar on unrelated business income tax, for example. So if you're familiar, and I'll talk a little bit about that today, when it applies to an IRA, a lot of people have those questions. How does it work? How is it calculated? And so you could go to our video library or search for us on YouTube and find our webinar that we just recently did on unrelated business income tax, or UBIT. And I think that you guys would find that really beneficial. If you haven't heard about a self-directed retirement account, the reason really just is probably that there aren't a lot of administrators out there that will hold private investments. So you might have a brokerage account, you consider it self-directed, you get to choose the investments that you make through that retirement account, but it's going to be investments that that brokerage is selling to you. So basically they give you a list, they say you can make these investments, you get to choose how much you want to put into each investment, and you can trade, sell whenever you want. But our definition of a self-directed IRA is more specific than that. We only hold private investments, so only things outside of the market. So buying real estate, investing in cryptocurrency, buying gold and silver bars and coins, investing in real estate options, investing in limited partnerships. All of those things are something that you can do through a retirement account, and those are things that we will hold on behalf of our clients. And we actually do the opposite of brokerage firms. We don't hold anything within the market, and so we're really not competing with them, but instead we're filling the gap in the industry for that service. I mentioned that just about any type of old, or actually any old retirement account, anything that you are no longer participating in, an old employer's plan, can be self-directed, anything that ends in IRA, and then also health savings accounts and what people call Coverdell education savings accounts, or CISAs, or education savings accounts. All of those can be self-directed. The rules for self-directing them all are the same, and so we can hold those accounts and help you with those. And so basically opening an account and starting to contribute is a way to do it. You can also transfer between accounts whenever you'd like. And so if you have an old employer plan, that can simply be rolled into typically a traditional IRA if it's all pre-tax. For example, you can transfer between traditional IRAs, you can move between Roth IRAs. And so funding these accounts really easy, or you can start brand new with us as well. And we actually have webinars on employer-based plans, so SEP, Simples, and solo 401ks. We have a webinar on HSAs, and so we do talk a lot about these types of accounts and try to educate you on why these accounts are beneficial, and you can check all of that out on our video library. So I'm going to just talk very quickly about the different investments that we see, and this is by no means a list, like the definitive list, basically. So the IRS doesn't say, here's what you can invest in. What they do instead is say, here's what you can't invest in. And so it's important to know that there are going to be things, there are going to be restrictions as to who you can invest with and what you can invest in, but that list is very small, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So what I like to do instead is talk about the things that we see pretty often at Advanta, really just to get your wheels turning and have you thinking about the things that you might want to invest in with a self-directed IRA, and again, as long as it's within the rules. So real estate investments, so single family homes, long-term or short-term rentals and rehab projects, that's pretty common. We see a lot of that stuff with Advanta IRA. People call us and say, I didn't know I could buy 123 Main Street in my IRA. And so they establish an account. Because this is not an all or nothing strategy, they're typically opening an account just for the investment that they're looking at that time. They move over the amount of money they need for that investment, and they are all set. I also have up here condos, mobile homes, and mobile home parks. Just keeping in mind that the IRS doesn't say, hey, it has to be a single family home, or hey, you have to invest in a limited partnership in order to invest in real estate. Truly, the investment is your own. And so it is completely up to you how you handle that. I also have up here real estate investment trusts. Some of those are going to be publicly traded, so we'll hold privately traded REITs, syndications and private placements, limited partnerships essentially into commercial property or multifamily, mobile home parks. All of those things exist, and we have seen them at Advanta. Paper assets, and really what we're going to be talking about today, mortgage loans, tax liens, tax deeds, unsecured notes. The IRS doesn't say, hey, this has to be secured by a mortgage or a deed of trust. So if you're willing to lend money unsecurely, you can do that. You just want to keep in mind that you want to do due diligence on the borrower. Make sure you feel comfortable with that investment. I know a lot of people will say, oh, I wouldn't lend unsecured, but we do have people that lend unsecured, and what they say, more risk, more reward. And so they're looking at making an investment with maybe a higher return, and maybe they trust that borrower. And so you just want to be comfortable with the investment that you're making. And I think I have an example of unsecured notes on here. Debenture notes, option contracts. We do see people make investments into real estate option contracts, basically giving an option or basically paying someone some amount of money in order to have the option to purchase their property at some point in the future for a certain price. And I think we have a webinar on that I did with Bill Cook, where he talks about options and how they work and investing smaller amounts of money for a bigger return down the line. So you can check that out in our video library. Assignments, joint ventures, accounts receivable, all of these are things that we have seen in an IRA account, and I'll talk more specifically about the loan aspect of that in just a minute. I also have up here LLCs. So we talk about LLCs for checkbook control. Many of you are familiar with that topic, and we do that as a webinar as well. So basically establishing a single member LLC with your IRA as the sole member, and you as the manager, so that you can have checkbook control of that account. You can also do that with a personal property trust or a land trust with a third-party trustee. So that's something we see a lot. And then, of course, LLCs, just very simply investing into other people's businesses. We've seen people invest in farm animals, partnerships. We've seen people invest in movie projects. I talked about precious metals, equipment leasing, foreign currency exchange, and the list really does go on and on. So again, this is not the definitive list. This is just to give you an example of investments that we see at Advanta, maybe on a more regular basis, But if you have an idea for an investment and you're wondering if it's something you can do in the IRA, give us a call and we can talk to you about that and how it may or may not work in the retirement account. So remember I said there was a couple of things that you can't invest in and a few people you can't invest with or do transactions with. And so we're going to talk about that very briefly here, but we do have a webinar that is self-directed basics where we talk more extensively about the rules and we give you examples. But prohibited investments, there are only two. So life insurance and collectibles, those are the asset classes that IRAs and 401ks cannot invest in. So life insurance and collectibles. And sometimes people ask me, well, what really is a collectible? And really what we're looking at here is if the value is based on something being rare or historic, that would be prohibited. You know, we talk about gold and silver bars and coins being allowed. And so people say, well, what if it's a gold coin? As long as the value is based on what the metal is trading at and not based on it being rare, it's probably something you can do. There is a list, though, of gold and silver coins, and if you have questions on that, just send me an email and I can get you that list so you can take a look at it. But then what are prohibited transactions? And that's any transaction between the plan and a disqualified person. And so disqualified persons are people up and down your lineal tree, and then spouses and business entities of those. So the IRA holder and IRA holder spouse, children, grandchildren, parents, grandparents, and any spouses or business entities of those. If it's your brother, sister, aunts, uncles, cousins, those people are not expressly prohibited from transacting with your IRA, but you do want to be careful in those transactions and make sure that they're for investment purposes. But with prohibited or disqualified persons, you want to make sure that you're not buying, selling, exchanging, providing sweat equity within, you have to make all of your investments within the rules and at an arm's length. So that's kind of how the IRS deems it, any arm's length transaction. So if I bought 123 Main Street, for example, then I couldn't lease it to my son or daughter. I couldn't let them live there. I couldn't have them out there rehabbing the property. All of those things would be considered prohibited. So typically I tell people investments for investment purposes, those typically would not include your family members. And so you just want to make sure that you understand the rules. And the last box that we have up here is unrelated business tax or unrelated debt finance income tax and when that applies. So the fact that an investment does trigger unrelated business income tax does not make it prohibited. So just keep that in mind. So if you have an investment that you're making and it would trigger UBIT or UDFI, sometimes those are used interchangeably, it doesn't make it prohibited. It just means that the IRA is going to have to calculate what that tax will be each year and then pay it. It's not a tax burden to you. It's a burden to the IRA. So the IRA does have to file an additional form. It's called a 990T. You want to work with an accountant that is familiar with this form and familiar with this tax. And then once you have it calculated, you let your account manager with Advanta know, and they will help you get that paid each year. When does it apply? Well, UBIT applies when business income is returned to the IRA, and that's important. It's not investment income. Typically, when IRA holders are receiving income to their IRAs, it's considered passive or investment income. We don't often see business income being returned to an IRA, and I know many of you are going to ask me to define that, and I'm not a CPA, so I'm not going to do that here. But you might find more information on my partner Alex's webinar on UBIT regarding what would classify as business income. But basically understanding that if you're going to invest and business income is going to be returned to the IRA or 401k, that UBIT is going to apply. And this can apply to private equity investments because the second time that an IRA could be exposed to UBIT is when there's financing on real estate. So the IRS does say that you can purchase real estate with financing, but it is going to trigger UBIT in an IRA. Now, this is different than business income UBIT because if it's in a 401k, it may not apply. So again, just familiarizing yourself with the rules and when it would or would not apply would be very important. And if you're investing into a limited partnership, it could apply then too, because if you're investing into a limited partnership that is going to purchase real estate with financing, it does apply to IRA limited partners. So again, just some things that you should be aware of when you're making investments. Now, typically, IRAs are making passive investments. They're typically not using financing to purchase real estate. It's typically cash. And so most of the time, we don't see many scenarios where UBIT would apply. But you could reach out to us and say, hey, this is the investment I'm making. Do you think UBIT would apply? We'll say you should talk to a CPA. It may apply in this scenario. So you can always reach out to us and we can do our best to give you some guidance on when you need to reach out to a CPA. So now we're going to jump into types of private lending and how it works within a retirement account. And so we do see a lot of traditional mortgage lending, but typically we're going to see short-term transactional funding or short-term lending, something like 1 to 5 years, for example. I was at an exchange meeting this morning, and a lot of times people are talking about short-term lending, and everybody's definition of short-term is different, but typically you'll hear people talk about anything less than 5 years. We see lending that is 6 months or 9 months or anything less than 12 months. And so it could be all over the place, but we also see stuff that's more typical 15 to 30 year. I even see 50-year notes at times. We do see unsecured promissory notes, and we again talked about doing your due diligence on your borrower and making sure you're comfortable with that investment. And really that goes for any type of lending that you're doing. If you're lending money and it's secured by a mortgage or a deed of trust, you still want to be comfortable with your borrower, do your due diligence on the borrower and the property. And so we'll talk a little bit about that coming up. Equity participation, we do see a lot of that at Advanta. So basically lending money and then not only getting some interest rate returned to the IRA, but also some level of participation on the sale of the property as well. And then secured notes, meaning anything secured to anything aside from real estate. So we've seen farm equipment, automobiles, livestock, and so those are all secured notes. And how do you secure those? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the great thing about private lending in your IRA is that it's kind of like having, it's a scenario where you know what the rate of return to your retirement account is going to be. So if you're lending at 8% in 1 point, then you know that's your return. If you're lending at 15% in 3 points, or whatever it is that you decide you want in that retirement account, if you find a borrower and you guys agree on those terms, then you know what the return is going to be in your retirement account. So as the holder, you get to determine the amount borrowed, the interest rate, the length of term, if there's any equity participation, and when is the payment due. So sometimes we see typical monthly payments being returned to an IRA. Sometimes we see quarterly, and I've even seen single payment notes. So completely up to the IRA holder. And then the reverse would be true if you're a borrower. If you're borrowing from retirement accounts, you and the IRA holder are going to work out the terms between you. Advanta IRA does not get involved in that. And so if you guys agree at, okay, well, it's going to be 5% interest rate for 6 months, but then the lender gets maybe, 15% of the return when the property sells, or whatever those terms are that you agree on, completely between the lender and the borrower. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so benefits of private lending. Again, you get to act as the bank and determine the return to your retirement account. You set the rate at which your IRA will grow. There's less liability than owning real estate directly in the IRA. So keeping in mind things like not dealing with tenants, toilets, and termites, but being invested in real estate in some way. Private lending might be something that you look at. If you had a property, if you owned a property and there was a slip and fall, as a property owner, you could be liable. But if you were lending money on that property in the form of a mortgage, let's say, and there was a slip and fall, well, the property owner might be liable. And so it might be less liability to be the mortgage holder, essentially, instead of owning the property in the IRA. Can be a very low maintenance asset. So once you lend money, it could be set it and forget it. And I know many people will say the same about owning real estate, but for those private lenders out there, they might say, well, I would rather lend money, not have maintenance on the property, not have to worry about the tenant, not have to worry about all the things that go with being a landlord in my retirement account. So I would rather do the private lending, where I find a good borrower, it has a good piece of collateral behind it, we agree on terms, and then I just receive a monthly payment back to my IRA. And you can partner funds among other IRAs and individuals. I'm going to go into some case studies now. I did not see any questions pop up, so I just want to encourage everybody to make sure to post any questions you have in the question box as we go. The first case study we're going to talk about is a first mortgage. And so this is sort of just a very basic strategy, something that we see at Advanta IRA all the time. And I'm going to talk about this first mortgage, and then I'm going to talk about the first mortgage in another way that we see it as well. So in this example, Paul has $120,000 in an IRA and wants more consistent terms. He meets a private mortgage broker who can place his IRA funds into a first mortgage with a qualified buyer. I get often asked, and I know my colleagues do too, where do you find borrowers or where do you find lenders? How does that work? And the honest truth is networking. We see a lot of people at the different investment clubs that we attend and network at. And a lot of times you see deals going on in that room and people meeting and networking. And so you might have a private money lender in there and then somebody who rehabs properties, and they have the opportunity to connect through that networking and agree on terms and borrow money or lend money or whatever it might be. And so that is typically what I recommend when people say, well, where do we go to find these borrowers or where do we go to find lenders? And at this time, I'll just remind you quickly too that Advanta has its own networking event every other Friday. And so the next one will be next Friday, September 9th at noon Eastern time. And you can join that and you can talk about what you're looking for or what you have. And so if you're a private money lender, you can say, well, I have $50,000. I want to lend it out, maybe in the form of a first mortgage, terms to be negotiated, or whatever you're looking for. You can join our event, but there are a lot of real estate investment clubs out there where you can do that networking as well. And so they could be in your local area where you can attend in person if you wanted to. And there's a lot still on Zoom as well. So something to look at. So Paul vets the property and the borrower. So again, he's going to do his due diligence. That's not something Advanta does. So we don't say, yep, this looks good, go ahead and make this investment. We say, please sign these forms that say this is the investment that you want to make. And you understand that this is your investment and we're not doing any due diligence. So you guys want to make sure that you're doing your due diligence on the property. Maybe you're checking out the property, pulling comps, or having an agent, real estate agent, pull comps for you so that you're looking at properties in the area. You could look at maybe what rental income will be on that property and what they are on other properties in the area as well, to make sure that if you ever had to foreclose and take the property back, you would know that you would be recouping at least some of your investment there. And the borrower, so you're going to look at the borrower as well, make sure that they're a good payer, make sure that they have, some track record. Maybe you prefer they have some skin in the game, so you're looking for a big down payment, or you're looking for a certain amount of money if you're lending on the property and the rehab of that property. So again, completely up to you. In this case, Paul agrees to lend $120,000 at 8% with a 5-year balloon, and the monthly payment is $800. And Paul is happy because he has a first mortgage on the property. So we had a question pop up, who does the paperwork, who puts the paperwork together on the loan? Advanta does not do the legal documents. And so we're not going to put the note and mortgage together or anything like that. And so who does it? Well, our clients work with title agents and closing attorneys, and any of those can do it. You can, look to the investor community that you're a part of for, a recommendation for that. And you can also reach out to Advanta, and we could definitely refer you to, attorneys and closing and title agents that could maybe help you with that as well. So Paul, so who does what basically? So Paul opens and funds an IRA account with Advanta. He finds the loan. So basically he's working with, let's say, his title agent in this case to put the note and mortgage together. So he's going to review all of that information, send it to Advanta. They agree on terms, and so once he sends the note and mortgage over to Advanta, we're going to review it to make sure that the IRA is properly titled as the lender. So in this scenario, the IRA is the lender, and so we'll review the note and mortgage to make sure that that is all true. Then we're going to send all the forms back to Paul through DocuSign. We're going to attach 2 forms that basically give us permission from Paul to make this investment on his behalf. So he's going to make sure that the note and mortgage include the terms that him and his borrower agreed upon. So, remember, if you're having a third party, especially put the note and mortgage together, you want to review it, make sure all the terms are what you agreed upon, and then he's going to approve those through DocuSign. And once that's done, we are going to fund the investment through the title agent or the closing attorney, whomever that might be. And so we work alongside them in order to make sure that the closing gets done on a timely manner and by the deadline. And so sometimes people come to us and say, oh, I have 30 days before this closing. And sometimes people come to us and say, hey, I have 48 hours. So if you're working on a tight timeline, then you just want to let your Advanta IRA account manager know so that we can help make sure that it gets funded on time. After closing, the borrower sends monthly interest-only payments to Advanta. A question I get a lot is, well, what if I'm making sure that that payment is coming in on the 1st of every month? Are you guys checking it off to make sure that it is paid on the 1st? And the answer is no. Advanta is not making sure that your borrower is paying. Remember, we're not a loan servicer, so you're going to follow along on your portal and get automatic emails once funds are deposited to your account as income on that investment. But if that isn't good enough for you, so a great example is we have the Labor Day weekend coming up here. And so if your borrower sends in their check and it is received Friday, so like tomorrow, if it's received on a Friday and it doesn't get deposited Friday because the mail was late, then it's not going to get deposited until Tuesday. And so if you called and said, hey, which day was that check received? Was it Friday? Was it Saturday? Was it Tuesday? And the answer is we're not tracking that. So one way you could keep track is you could always have your borrower send the check to you. It must be made payable to your IRA account. And then you could forward it on to Advanta so you can check it off in your ledger. You can use a loan servicing company. Your borrower can send an ACH as long as they use the proper information so that when we receive it, we know it gets credited to your account. And so there's a couple different ways that you can work with your borrower to make sure that those payments are getting in on time and that you can also follow along and make sure that they're being received on time. Payments are deposited to Paul's IRA account, and he can track that through monthly payments using online statements. And also, we do send an automatic email if you opt in for that. So when your borrower pays and it's deposited to your account, you will get an email. So in this case, Paul would get an email that $800 was received for the mortgage payment on 123 Main Street. So he would know that we did receive it and it was deposited. And then when the borrower decides to sell the house, Paul's IRA will receive the $120,000 at sale, because remember this was interest only. His IRA made $28,800, and he's ready to make a new investment. And remember that Paul's IRA does not pay capital gains, and this is a great example of an investment for Paul that did not incur any kind of UBIT or anything like that. This was just a passive investment. And so once his money is back in the IRA, there's no holding period or anything. So if he had an investment set up for the next day, we could turn those monies around. The next question was, do you pay taxes when you take the money out of the IRA account? Yes, you do. Remember that if you have a tax deferred account, then when you take a distribution at retirement, you are going to pay taxes as in ordinary income. So if I took $1,000 from my IRA once I reach retirement age, that's going to be considered 1099 income, so ordinary income to me the year that I take it out. And of course, the exception would be a Roth IRA. So if I have a Roth IRA and it's been open for 5 years and I'm over 59 and a half, then there is no penalty and no taxes paid on that IRA money. If I have a tax deferred account, a traditional IRA, a simple, a SEP, or a pre-tax 401k, once I reach 59 and a half, I take distributions. It's 1099 ordinary income to me in the amount and year that I take it. And that is true not just with a self-directed IRA, but any IRA account. So keep that in mind. The rules don't change because you're self-directing your account. The account rules are the same across the board. So whether you're with Advanta or a brokerage firm, those rules for IRAs and taxation are going to be exactly the same. So before I go on to this equity partnership, I want to talk about the other way that I have seen first mortgages in a retirement account. And we had a question about this just a couple of weeks ago, so I just wanted to talk very quickly about it as well. But basically, we have seen clients buy property, so they buy 123 Main Street in their IRA, and then they sell it on seller financing. So now you've taken a purchase of 123 Main Street in your IRA, and you turned around and sold it and turned it into a note in your IRA. It could be a first mortgage. Maybe you sell it and you say, well, you could get other money and I'll subordinate and be a second mortgage for, 30,000 or the rehab money or whatever it might be. Again, your deal is your own, but that is something that we have seen. So when you buy real estate in an IRA, if you do it directly through the IRA, then on the deed, it's going to be Advanta IRA Services, FBO, your name, your account number as the buyer. The IRA typically will pay cash, but we'll talk about a scenario where it might finance. So it buys that property. Whether you intend on doing some work to that property or putting a tenant in that property or finding a buyer for that property is completely up to you. But the IRA would pay all expenses. It would receive all of the income. And let's say you put you put a tenant in that property, and then you find somebody who wants to buy it down the road, you decide to sell it with seller financing, then you might sell that property. Maybe you ask for a specific amount in down payment, and now instead of having that property in the IRA, you now have a note. So if you guys have questions on that, let me know, but that is definitely something that we see. So I had a question pop up here. What are some ways you can check credibility records of the borrower? I'm not super comfortable answering that question. You might have an attorney maybe run a background check. You might ask other investors that have worked with that borrower before. But since I really don't have an answer for you, I'm not comfortable answering that. But definitely a place to start would maybe be like either a credit check or talking to other investors who've maybe worked with that borrower before. If you're using, a mortgage company where basically they're putting borrowers and lenders together, they certainly could do some sort of background check for you as well. So I know that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but if you send me an email, I'll look and see if we have somebody to refer that will handle that kind of service. I had another question pop up. When you transfer money between IRAs, does it go from a Roth to a traditional to a Roth? How does that work? You choose how you want to do, and as long as it's allowed within IRS rules, we can do it. So if you have a traditional IRA and you want it to become a Roth, we have to move like money to a like money account. So it has to go traditional to traditional or pre-tax to pre-tax. But then if you want to convert it to a Roth IRA, you certainly could do that. And just remembering that is a taxable event. So if you have a pre-tax account and you want it to come over to a pre-tax account so that this is not a taxable event, then typically I just say, well, what type of account are you moving over to us from? And if you say, well, I have a SEP IRA, then I would say, well, we can hold a SEP IRA for you here at Advanta. If you have a simple, we can hold a simple. If you have just a traditional IRA, then we would set up a traditional IRA for you here. If you did want to do a Roth conversion, we typically will establish the pre-tax account for you here. IRS rules say that we have to bring money across pre-tax to pre-tax essentially, and then we can do the Roth conversion, or you can always do the Roth conversion with your current custodian and then just simply open a Roth with us and transfer between Roth IRAs. If you're moving from an old employer plan, that's considered a direct rollover typically, and you can do a direct rollover from a pre-tax account to a traditional IRA, or you can opt to pay the taxes and you can do a direct rollover from a pre-tax 401k to a Roth IRA. And so that would be a direct Roth conversion. I had another question pop up. Does the IRA holder recognize interest income as debt service payments over the life of the loan? I'm not sure I'm going to answer this correctly. So if you want to repost it if I don't get it right, but the IRA holder is going to have interest income on, basically the loan payments. Now, if you have seller financing, it's going to be up to you as to what you lend that money out as. If you're a second mortgage or a third mortgage or whatever it might be, you're going to structure that in the way that you're looking to structure it. I'm not sure if I'm answering that correctly. So if you want to repost and let me know more specifically what you were looking for, I can answer that. Okay, I don't see any more questions at this time. And so I'm going to go on to our second case study here with equity partnership. And we do see a lot of this at Advanta. Andrea has $150,000 in an IRA and is interested in partnering with a rehabber to flip a house. She meets Steve at a local investor group, and Steve has a project that needs funding. She does her due diligence again on Steve and on the property. Steve agrees to use the property for collateral and some of his own funds as a down payment, and maybe that's something Andrea requires. Maybe she says, I'm going to lend money to you, but I want you to put X amount of dollars down, have some skin in the game. Excuse me, and then I will lend on both the property and some of the rehab project. And again, this is completely up to Andrea. And in this case, the loan is going to include purchase money and rehabbing the property. So who does what? Andrea is going to open her account and determine the terms with her borrower. She's going to loan $125,000 at an interest rate of 5% with equity participation in a third of the profits. So sometimes people see this example and say 5%, that seems really cheap for private money, but maybe it's because she has equity participation, so they agree upon that so that the rehabber pays less until he gets paid by selling the property. In this scenario, it's a 2-year balloon with a monthly payment of $520, and Andrea is happy with a first mortgage on the property. Andrea's attorney prepares the note and mortgage. She's going to read and approve everything, letting us know that this is the investment that she's agreeing to. And then Advanta IRA holds the note and mortgage on behalf of Andrea's IRA. We also receive any loan payments. And when Steve is ready to sell the property for $200,000 in this example, he requests a payoff amount. Andrea is going to work with her loan servicer to calculate the loan payoff and provide a payoff letter. So many of you guys who have purchased a property and sold a property, even if it was your personal residence, you're familiar with some of these steps because you would get the payoff amount from your mortgage company in order to know what the final payout will be upon the sale of the property. And that's the same case here, even though the IRA is the bank in this scenario. Andrea will then send the payoff letter to Advanta, and then we will help get that over to the title agent or the closing attorney or whoever might be involved. And then here are the numbers for you. And remember, this is just an example, but something we see often at Advanta. The repaid principal is $125,000. The monthly payments were $3,000 and a percentage of the profits. Remember, a third of the profits are $25,000. So the total earnings on this account were $28,000. And I also like to show the other side of this transaction with Steve's earnings because we have a relationship with a lot of borrowers in our community because they might not have a self-directed IRA. They might not be ready for that, but they do borrow from their lenders quite often. And if a lender says, hey, I'd love to lend on this project, but my money's all out working, I don't have anything to lend you, then those borrowers might say, well, you should learn about Advanta IRA and how they can help you use retirement funds so that you can lend it and have it grow tax deferred or tax free. And so we see that often. We actually have a webinar on other people's money, so using other people's money in a retirement account for investments. And I always kind of consider it a good tool in your tool belt to know about self-directed IRAs if you're out there in the community doing fix and flips and raising capital and things of that nature. So the original loan again was $125,000. The sale of the house was $200,000. He repaid Andrea and gave her a third of the profits at $28,000. And so in this scenario, Steve's earnings were $47,000. Okay. I'm sorry, guys, for the dead air there. I was just reading. Thank you so much for clarifying. They're asking in the interest payment question, is it picked up as interest income on their personal tax return, or is it income deferred until distribution? And it is the second. It's the latter. It is just IRA income. It is not, IRA income like profits and losses, that is just for the IRA, just as you would really look at it if you were invested in stock, for example, in your retirement account. That really wouldn't be any profit or loss to you. It's just to the retirement account. And that would be the same whether you're invested in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, or if you're invested into a private money mortgage, or if you're invested into real estate in the IRA. There's no tax deductions or anything like that for you, and no income received or realized personally. It's all in the IRA until the time that you take a distribution. And then at the time that you take distributions, regardless of the investment or asset class, it's just considered ordinary income in the form of a 1099 if it's pre-tax, and if it's a Roth and it's been established for 5 years and you're at retirement age, it would be tax-free. So thank you for the clarification on that. We're going to talk about using non-real estate for collateral and how that works. So we do see loans out of IRAs where people are using non-real estate as collateral. The note could be secured by stock in a company. Something that you want to know is that an IRA cannot own stock in an S corp, so that's important. That's actually S corp rules, and so if you're investing into a company, you want to make sure that you're not investing into an S corp. If you're going to have a note investment and it's secured by stock in a company and it's an S corp, just know what your exit strategy is, because the IRA cannot participate in the S corp directly, so that's very important to know. An IRA can hold a note secured by a prohibited investment, like a life insurance or collectible. But because it's a note in the IRA account and not the prohibited or disqualified asset class, that would be permitted. But again, knowing your exit strategy. So if you had a note, it was secured by a collectible, and that borrower did not pay, what would you do with that note? So you certainly could sell the note. You could distribute the note. So you would distribute the note before basically collecting on that investment. And so these are just a couple of things to look at when you're looking at non-real estate for collateral. You may be subject to unrelated business income. So it's going to depend on the asset and what you're lending on as to whether or not unrelated business income tax would apply here. So if it's real property, essentially real estate, the UBIT does not apply typically when you're lending money, but if it's non-real estate, it may apply. And understand the security agreement and where it's recorded. So something that is not real estate, how do you put people on notice that there is a lien on that investment? So, think about your car loan, for example, or, restaurant equipment, for example, maybe a UCC filing. And so, being aware of how that works and maybe working with an attorney that can help you with that. So now we're going to talk about unsecured lending. And we do see a lot of unsecured notes here at Advanta. Sometimes they're directly to companies, for example, and they might be short-term loans. And so, we do talk about this a little bit, and just remembering that the IRS doesn't say, okay, well, it has to be a first mortgage, or it has to be a second or third mortgage, and the property has to have a certain amount of value or anything like that. The IRS really kind of leaves it up to the IRA holder. As long as it's not something prohibited, they would allow it. So Tom's loan is $50,000 from his SEP IRA. He has a friend that wants to expand his business and needs short-term capital. Tom decides to lend the money from his SEP and is willing to lend the money without any collateral. Tom drafts the unsecured promissory note listing his IRA as the lender. He lends out $50,000 at an interest rate of 10%. It's a 1-year balloon note with a lump sum payment. So this is a single payment note. And so the money goes out. We hold the original note at Advanta, and we do need the originally signed note here at Advanta prior to funding, so that's very important. When the note is unsecured, we do require the original note with the borrower's signature prior to funding, because that is the instrument of security. So we need to have it here, and we keep that note for you in the event that the borrower does not pay. Special considerations, because there's no title company involved, again, we have to have the original note. Unsecured lending is riskier than conventional mortgages, and the interest rates tend to be a little higher. Think about your credit cards, for example, that's considered unsecured. Make sure you know your borrower, because it could be difficult to recover if in default. So that's very important. Again, knowing your exit strategy, you guys, when you're lending money in that form. So using financing to buy real estate, and this is a question we get a lot. I will tell you that about 99% of the time, when people are purchasing real estate through a retirement account, they're doing it with cash. That's typically what we see. That's almost a daily basis at Advanta. People want to buy 123 Main Street. The account holder has enough money in their IRA to purchase 123 Main Street, do any of the repairs that need to be done, and then they put a tenant in place. Sometimes we see partnering, so spouses partnering their IRAs together in order to buy 123 Main Street, for example, bringing outside partners. And I just did a great webinar with my partner, Corey, on partnering IRA and non-IRA funds in order to make investments. So if you're interested in that, that's in our video library. But basically, getting that money together and buying in cash, that's very typical. And then a lot of times when people don't have enough cash, they kind of do the private lending thing. So they'll say, well, I'll lend money on someone else's property. So very rarely do we see using financing to buy real estate. And you're going to see in just a second, there's some moving parts there. And I always think that it's sort of the moving parts that tend to be intimidating. It does not mean that the investment is not worth it, but it just means that you're going to have to look at that investment a little more closely and understand those moving parts in order to make that investment and make sure that the IRA is kind of doing what it needs to do in order to be compliant for IRS purposes. So in this deal, Mike wants to purchase a property. He has 160,000 and he finds a property for 150,000 that doesn't need any repair work. But he decides that instead of using all of that money to make the purchase, he's just going to make a down payment and finance the rest. So what does he need to do? Well, if he's going to put 60,000 down from his IRA, first of all, he needs to get a lender that's willing to work with his IRA. So I think that's very important here, guys, because a lot of times people say, well, I have a lender in place. They said that they would work with the IRA, but the lender might not realize that it has to be a non-recourse loan. And so that's one of those moving parts that I mentioned about earlier. It has to be non-recourse. It cannot be a recourse loan. You cannot sign a personal guarantee or extend your personal credit for your IRA. And so if you're looking at purchasing with financing, working with a lender that understands that is going to be really important, because Advanta is going to look for that non-recourse language in the note in order to do the processing and to fund the investment, because that is IRS rules. You can look that right up on their website in IRC 4975, where they talk about prohibited transactions, and basically it will say you cannot extend your personal credit or give a personal guarantee for an IRA investment. So that's very important. I can provide you with a list of IRA lenders that we have seen clients use in the past. You can check with your local bank. If you have a lender that you work with, check with them, see if they can lend in the non-recourse fashion. So just make sure that you understand, because that's going to be very important. And that rule applies whether you're investing with an IRA or a 401k, because sometimes people get these moving parts confused and they say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to the 401k. And it's very important that you understand it does. It does apply to a 401k as well. It has to be non-recourse. So in this deal, the loan is $90,000 and the rate is 6%. And, I'm sure it may be around there. It may have gone up a little bit too. And this is just really an example, but just so you guys know, typically if it's non-recourse, it's going to be a point or two higher than whatever the market rate is. And the lender is going to look at the property. So they're going to do a rental analysis on that property. They're going to see what the rental income is going to be. They want to make sure that your rental income can cover those monthly payments. So that's really how they determine how much they want down and what the interest rate is going to be. I typically do not see institutions that do non-recourse loans lending on a rehab project, so keep that in mind. You might have a private money lender that is willing to do that, lend non-recourse to the IRA for something that you're not planning on holding, but institutions are typically not going to do that. It never hurts to ask, but I haven't seen it. So they get a 30-year amortized loan with a monthly payment of $540. The annual payments come to $6,500. So what are those moving parts? Not guaranteeing the loan. The bank can only foreclose and take the property back, so they're not going to go after Mike personally. The loan is to the IRA, and the IRA makes the loan payments. That's very important. I can't stress that enough. The loan is to the IRA, guys. The IRA makes the loan payments. Very important. You want to make sure that you have monthly income on that property that's going to cover all of the expenses, including the loan payments coming directly from the IRA. Non-recourse, again, 30 to 40% down. You're going to see a few points higher on the interest rate typically. Income received on the mortgage is subject to unrelated business income tax or unrelated debt finance income tax. So this is another one of those moving parts. If you purchase real estate in an IRA and you use financing, you're going to expose your IRA to unrelated business income tax. And that tax is directly related to the amount you borrow and the income on the investment. So if you borrow 50%, 50% of the income is going to be taxable, and it is at trust tax rates. The IRA files an additional form every year called 990T. Advanta IRA does not put the 990T form together for you. You want to work with a CPA that is familiar with this form and can help you with deductions, because in this scenario, the IRA does get deductions. This almost never happens, but when the IRA pays UBIT, it does get some deductions. And then there's no 990T necessary if the total of unrelated debt finance income liability is less than $1,000. So again, taxes are paid at trust tax rates, and I have an example of this for you guys. Okay, so here you go. Total monthly rents, $2,000 with financing. You know, the income is going to be the same. And so basically we're comparing with financing and then with an all cash purchase, just to give you an idea. So of course the income is going to be the same. You're going to have loan payments with financing of $6,500, and of course with an all cash purchase, nothing. Your expenses are going to be the same, $6,000. Net prior to UDFI, $11,500 or $18,000 if it's an all cash purchase, and just the difference there being the loan payments. Net income subject to UDFI is $6,900. And again, that's related directly to the amount borrowed. So how much did the client borrow? And that percentage is going to be, you're going to take that yearly income, and you're going to do that math to find out what percentage of the total monthly rents are going to be subject to unrelated debt finance income tax. So $6,900 of the rent is going to be exposed to the tax. And so at 28%, so trust tax rates are very high, the tax is going to be roughly $1,932 deducted. Basically, we did the math all the way down for you here. So your income when purchased with financing is $9,568 versus $18,000 of the all cash purchase. Now, this example does not include deductions and depreciation, so keep that in mind. This is just a very simple calculation to kind of get you thinking about how it works, but there would be deductions and depreciations that would possibly apply here. As you pay down the debt, you're going to owe less in unrelated business income tax. Once you pay it off and it's been paid off for 12 months, you no longer have that additional burden. Now, something to keep in mind here too is sometimes people will say to me, well, why would anybody want to do that? Why would you get financing in an IRA if you want to expose it to the tax, and two, it has to be non-recourse, which could be more difficult to find? And the answer is you may be able to increase your purchase. So, you know, in this example, the client had the money to purchase the property but decided to use financing. And why would that be? Maybe because instead he could buy 2 properties, for example. So he's really increasing what he can purchase by using financing. And sometimes I have people say, nope, that's it. I don't want to do that. That seems very complicated. And I have other people that say, hey, this is very worth it to me. I definitely want to increase my spending limit by using financing to purchase. And I'll give you another example of what I've seen a client do. Basically, they purchased a property with all cash. They refinanced it out after a couple of years, or financed it out after a couple of years to buy a second property. So there's a good example of a client that said, you know what, I want to add to this and I don't have the money, but I have this really great property that it would get really good loan terms because it's an existing rental and it has been for years. And so they used it in order to get some financing on that property to buy a second property in the retirement account. So it's really easy to get started. Just give us a call, reach out to us. If you're already in contact with somebody, you can reach out to that individual with any questions. You certainly are welcome to reach out to me with any questions. And we'd love to hear from you guys. We have, again, classes every week. There are always no cost, no obligation. If you're looking to get started, it's just about 15 minutes to complete your application. And then we can fund as quickly as we have money moved over from an existing IRA. Just keeping in mind that if you're opening a brand new account, the IRS does require us to hold all new accounts for 7 days. And then outside of that, this is basically a cash purchase. So if you're purchasing all in cash and your money comes over to us from your brokerage firm, we can close in 2 to 3 days. We're just looking for paperwork and we need to know who we're working with for that investment. So title agent, closing attorney, and possibly any real estate agents involved as well. Here's my contact information again for you guys so that you can reach out to me. Remember that the handouts are, the slides are added to the handouts, so you can check that out and download that, and I'll just give you guys a couple of seconds and I'll check the question box again. If you have any questions, please make sure to get them typed into the question box now before we close the webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining me. I hope you learned something today about private lending and self-directed IRAs. We have many great webinars planned for the upcoming months as we sort of finish out the year here. I always feel like this is the downward slope of the year, and so we'll be moving quickly through to December and end of year tax planning, and we'll be talking about tax planning for the end of the year and coming up for 2023 as well. So just make sure to check out our events. My name is Larissa Greene. I'm happy to answer any questions for you. Thank you. Take care and have a great day.